All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of The Compliance Guy. It is Monday, the 11th day of December in 2023. And this is our last Coding and Compliance Roundtable for 2023. We will return the first Monday in December. That is not New Year's Day. So I think it's the following week. So, as always, I want to begin by saying thank you all for tuning in, logging on, and hanging out with us just for a little while. We got a great program for you today. I'm joined by my all-star cast of characters, Terry Fletcher, Scott Kraft, Stephanie Hour, Paul Spencer, and last but not least, Miss Christine Hall. Welcome. All right. So I know there were some rumors going around last week as to why I was not at the National Alliance of Medical Auditing Specialists conference, even though I was scheduled to do a couple of different sessions there. First, let me share with you that I did not have any type of emergency surgery. I almost wished that I had because I was sitting in a federal courtroom in Boston, Massachusetts for my 7th federal criminal trial of 2023. I will be careful because the jury is still in deliberation, so I don't want to give any critiques at this moment. But stay tuned because I have lots of critiques. All right. So let's jump in and let's tackle some of our topics today. But the very first one I want to go to is Stephanie Howard, because I think what we're about to talk about is extremely good news, because there are so many oncology groups, there are so many rheumatology groups out there that are continuously receiving denials for infusion medications simply because of the brand name and not using a cheaper, not the same as the brand biosimilar. And I know there may be some out there that go, no, Sean, the biosimilars are just as good. No, I have enough. Anyways, I'll get a couple of the clinicians on and we'll talk about those. Stephanie, let's talk about this new policy that goes into effect this month and why it's so critical.
Yeah, so to give a little more context to what Sean was saying, what we've been dealing with more so in rheumatology are some of the CMS MACs that have put out articles, and they've stated that depending on the type of drug that you're using, even if it's a complex biologic agent, that they don't want you billing the chemotherapy administration. So the most common ones we come across with this are definitely Symphony, Aria, and Orencia. And basically, what was happening, and Sean and I had a back and forth pull on this as well with our clients, because practices were in a really bad place where you have the National Rheumatology Association out there doing awesome advocacy for providers in this space and working really hard, meeting with CMS to combat this and make it so they can get paid appropriately for the risk of that medication that they're infusing. But the problem is that they were having all of those awesome conversations behind closed doors, and CMS kept saying, "Oh, you can bill chemotherapy administration," and they're saying it verbally, but they didn't give it to anybody in writing. And then on top of it, there were articles in place. If you go into like the CMS MCD coverage search and you look at the different MACs and even put in, Symphony, Aria, or those drug names, the articles come up that direct you that you cannot bill chemotherapy administration. So I want to say we've been in this back and forth. It feels like a couple of years. I've kind of lost track of time at this point. But we've had groups that are choosing to still bill chemotherapy admin. And then, I know for us on our side, we were really nervous because there's nothing to combat this in writing. So, all of that to say, as of last week, CMS has put out something in writing officially. So, it's dated December 7th, and it's going into effect December 21st of this year. And they're stating that the MACs, they're giving written direction finally to these MACs that they're not allowed to deny for chemo administration just based on the name of a drug. So, what that's going to do is give some backing to the practices that are going to continue to bill chemotherapy administration. If you're in any issues with your MAC or audits, we finally have something in writing to support you billing for the complexities of those drugs and infusions.
And so, Stephanie, quickly talk about the fact the new policy also addresses high complexity um, infusions, right? Because this has been a big area of contention with audits. So, can you talk a little bit about what constitutes and what qualifies for this type of infusion?
Well, and it's funny you say that, Sean, because I think that this is going to be I even myself, after reading this, have to think on it a little bit, because the question I asked myself when I read that was, what do I, as an auditor, now want to see in documentation to argue or defend somebody that, yes, this is highly complex? Because a couple of things, we can go into the HCPCS manual, we can look at certain drugs, we can look at the administration code. They talk about the fact that they are a complex biologic agent. Even further than that, one thing that's helped me personally over the years having the conversations is listening to physicians and providers in rheumatology and having them explain why clinically they are so different. But the question really becomes, how is that going to be seen within documentation? So, one of the first and most obvious to me, anyways, who do you have administering and watching the patient? This summer I was speaking for the Florida Rheumatology Society, and there was some back and forth about drugs that were thought to be complex, but yet an MA is administering the drug versus a licensed RN. So there's some thought there. One of the other things as well, if you just think about the performance of the infusion, it requires the patients to be monitored the whole time. They're not monitored by a provider, but they're monitored by nursing. And that's not something that we see in documentation. We see that they're the ones performing, administering on the nursing level, but we don't always see the additional monitoring. So I'm going to give some further thought to it, but what I'm thinking is that we need some additional language built into these templates for infusions that are further backing the fact that those are more complex drugs.
So, for our listeners and followers, I just went ahead and posted the publication 100-20 one-time notification for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and it's transmittal 12397. And if you are following us along um, in the chat, you will actually see the um, post that I put in there for you, so you can go ahead and do your internet search and pull it down. I think this is a positive change. One of the things that I said to the panel before we got started is I think this is something, once it goes into effect, that when practices are getting denied for the same thing by commercial payers, I think you take this change notification and you submit it to them and you show them that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services even has recognized that you don't simply refuse infusions for chemotherapy or rheumatological medications simply based on the drug name, as long as every other requirement is met. So we're going to continue to track this one. We'll see kind of where it leads into Q1 of 2024, and I'm sure we'll have some updates for you then. All right. So Paul Spencer, I want to go to you next because you are the person we subject to the American Medical Association symposium each year. And I know Christine, Terry, and Scott will all have some things that they want to give as feedback as well. Can you talk about some of the more prolific changes and some of those that need to be really carefully um, uh, understood by our listeners, our viewers, our followers, so that it's not a huge surprise for them in January of 2024?
Well, certainly. Those who were in attendance at the NAMUS conference this past week know that I did a session with Ashley Morgan of Lyles Parker on AI and healthcare and where that's going. One session that focused on digital medicine during the AMA symposium really brought that into stark brought forward the stark realities of exactly what's happening as far as the treatment of patients using things such as virtual reality and artificial intelligence. This is, remote monitoring has been growing over the last few years as we've seen codes added to that. And most of the things that were added this year for digital medicine are in the category 3 realm. So we may not see reimbursement for them in the immediate, but it's obviously something that the AMA felt strong enough about that they created a code set for it. And over a 5-year period, we may see the evolution of some of these codes. I mean, some things such as training people who've had strokes using virtual reality to in motor cognitive effects for gait and things of that nature. It's kind of amazing what's going on in the world of medicine. I mean, from the age where I was born, where there wasn't even an arthroscope, and now every knee surgery and shoulder surgery is done with an arthroscope. I know we'll talk quite a bit about some of the things that are still going on in the E&M universe and the rest of the broadcast. But that really jumped out to me as far as dedicating an entire session to digital medicine and some of the frontiers that we're going to be seeing over the next 5 years as this develops.
So remote patient monitoring, and I'm sorry, Kristen, I'll get right to you.
Yeah.
I went ahead and posted in the chat my most recent blog that I did on remote patient monitoring not too long ago. If you hadn't seen it, you can find it in the comments section. But this is one that I think is going to remain a hot audit target in 2024 because of the number of bad actors out there. And we, doctors management team that's on here, I know we have all had some interesting conversations with folks wanting to use RPM for some strange reasons. But take a look at some of the Code of Federal Regulations, some of the things that I put in there for you, and hopefully you'll find that to be a beneficial post. All right, Christine, I'm so sorry I didn't mean to step on you.
No, that's okay. I was going to say another thing AMA did this year. I'm one of those people, I do review all of the changes throughout the CPT book, but there seems to be a lot of conversation when we don't have a category 1 or a category 3 code to be using those unlisted. Like they're really pushing this year for us to understand. They gave a lot of great examples in the introduction of CPT of when it's appropriate to use those unlisted codes. Again, I know that they're pain. I know that they're very much like category 3. You've got to have all of your documentation submitted and send in what you think it's reimbursed at so they can review that and look at it. But the overall idea that I got from that information was that the AMA has heard there's a lot of new technology out there, and we're going to be trying things in more efficient types of ways. And they do want us to get reimbursed for this new technology. So, piggybacking off what you said, Paul, was just, we do have to, we are being asked to do it, to try it, to see it and explain it to AMA so that they can get us reimbursed for those.
Yeah, usually with category 3, what we're dealing with is, maybe Medicare covers it and the commercial insurers are like, call me when there's a real CPT code. So we'll have to keep an eye on the 2024 fee schedule to see if any of this is really taking hold to such a point that Medicare is going to reimburse for it. But I just found that entire session fascinating because we're really going down different medical roads now and using technology that's a far cry from what you usually see in a long-term acute care or long-term rehab setting.
Yep. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the other changes, which some folks don't think it's significant, but I do. Um, who is willing to take on the discussion of the AMA switching back to typical times for E&M services? Terry, you want to take that one?
Sure. I'm not really sure where there's a big difference. And the reason I say that is because you can't get to the next level, with the exception of level 5, until you get to the met or exceed time. And I think they were just becoming in line with what they did in the hospital this year. So they're trying to have consistency throughout, basically saying that, if we say it in this, if we say it in the hospital or if we say it in the office, then the language is very similar. So there's not a lot of overlap, or, well, you can't do this in the office, but you can do it in the hospital. We had that in 2021. It was a nightmare. And so I was having to use two different sets of documentation guidelines even. And so I think that when they say met or exceeded, if you notice, you still can't get to, from a level 2 to a 4 unless you meet or exceed the next time threshold. So for me, that's not a big deal. Where it actually makes a difference is for those people that are using prolonged services on level 5, in my opinion, because you had to, for example, a level 5 new patient visit used to be 60 to 70, well, is right now 60 to 74 minutes, and that'll change in 2024 to you have to at least meet 60 minutes. So then is Medicare going to allow that prolonged service at the, starting at the 1 minute, 61-minute mark and then 15 minutes out? And, they haven't clarified yet, but I'm assuming that that's how they're going to come in line with AMA. And so that's a really big difference. But I'm still finding, because I don't know, I feel like time is a trap. When they hide in the transmittal that we're going to look at everything, they say it objectively. I kind of laugh at that and think it's subjectively because it's their opinion on what would be considered a believable day and time. They're going to look at those more closely than looking at medical decision making, because it can be manipulated and because they added with or without face to face. And so, everyone has to really use caution with the prolonged care on a level 5, in addition to it, when looking at time, because I could see 75 minutes being abused versus it used to be you'd have to hit 89 minutes on a new patient to get that. And that's hard to do. That is hard to do and be profitable. So I talk to doctors about that all the time when I see 10 level 5s and 4 prolonged care, and then I see they also had 20 established patient visits. I'm like, when do you sleep? This actually looks like a 16-hour day, but you were only here for 4 hours. How is that even possible?
And
Because you're using time. And they're like, oh, well, it can be non-face-to-face. And let me just tell you what I was doing in the back room. I'm like, seriously, I don't want to know. It's really scary to me when I see some of the assumptions made on this. And I know we're going to get to a topic on medical decision making later,
yeah,
and that's
and
another
and
thing.
and I want to talk about this time thing because I just came off of my 7th federal criminal trial,
Yeah,
and time in the what they call the impossible day
yeah.
has been something that the government is looking at, and I'm going to explain why the impossible day theory is garbage from the government's perspective. And I'll explain that. And Terry, I know exactly where you're going with this, and we're going to come back to it in a minute. Christine, I
Yeah.
want to give you the floor for a minute because I know you had a couple of thoughts on this as well.
I have a thought. So, and again, this is completely my rationale for it, but it kind of touches on what you're saying, Sean. My opinion is that they took the range out because you have a lot of auditors, you have a lot of providers that are very black and white. And so if it is this time, it fits this code. If it is this time, it fits this code. And by leaving it open-ended, you have to meet or exceed. So you have the opportunity now to say, well, I've met this time. However, since I no longer have a range, what if I felt that it was a low complexity visit? Or what if I felt, even though I spent 25 minutes with this patient, not going to be a 214. It's a 213. And now maybe we took some of that black and white out, and we allow the gray where you can select a lower level because it's not firm, this to this. And that's just my thought. It just opened up that so that we could maybe address that impossible day by saying not every visit, although you've met that time, needs to be there, because the previous code also says met or exceeded as well.
Scott, you and I've talked about this. Can you, before Sean gets on his, can you mention something? Because I know Sean and I are going to conflict on this. I just know it. We always conflict on everything. So
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about with time, I'll take it from both angles, and you know, I've had some connectivity issues today, so if I repeat something, I apologize. Um, you know, one of the things I said at the NAMUS conference last week is my personal view that time should be documented when your intent as a rendering provider is to use it to build a service. And one of the things I found going back to the old guidelines, when providers embrace time as their billing metric, so they've kind of decided we're going to bill the time and that's what I want to do. I'll say not always, but it's been my experience that a lot of times the quality of the documentation suffers as a result, because the provider says, well, let's have the time. I've said it's 25 minutes, it's 30 minutes, whatever that may be. And as a result, like, I don't feel as though I need to be as descriptive necessarily as part of the history, as part of the medical decision making, because I'm not using it. And so what ends up happening is I have a lot of notes where the provider says it took 30 minutes, and I'm kind of scratching my head to try to figure out what they're actually doing. And so I don't think that that's fraud per se, but I think I think it exposes the provider to there being questions about what exactly is happening to justify the use of that time from a medical necessity perspective. And the last thing I'll say on this is, where I do think a provider can find themselves in at least potentially being accused of something fraudulent is, you know, time statements that I read almost always end in whatever the unit of time is that associates with that code. So I had all these 99214s in 2020 and earlier that were 25-minute visits, and they all sort of became 30-minute visits as we went into 2024 or 2021, excuse me. And because the time doesn't have to be face to face with the patient anymore, to the point we talked about earlier, it creates this sort of gray area where time is being counted by the provider that can't necessarily be traced in the event of an external review. But the one caution I would add, and I've seen this in some of the audits that we've worked on internally, there are all manner of different ways to track what you are doing as the provider, like when you log into the EMR, when you log out of the EMR, when you're in a patient chart, when you're in a different patient's chart, when you badge into your office, when you badge out. So all these time statements that you're using, when you are using them, I would certainly encourage you to be as accurate and precise as possible. This to the providers. And another reason for me that I don't recommend using time for every visit is that creates for you as the provider in the aggregate the risk that if you're being imprecise with your time, you end up with a number that you're claiming you spent that seems misaligned to the payer with your actual day.
So, real quick, I want to address and I want to get the panel's thoughts on this. You know, from Rosman. You know, what do you guys think about RPM companies offering to bill for these services on behalf of the provider because they don't have enough staff? My answer is absolutely not. I would strongly discourage you from giving your provider number to a third party who says, "Oh, we'll bill on your behalf," because if something goes wrong, you don't get to say, "I didn't do it," because you still enriched yourself through the billing processes of another entity. Now, if you if you suffer some type of damages due to gross negligence or something like that, that's a different story, but the government's not going to care. If the services are billed wrong, you're on the hook for it. So I don't ever recommend allowing somebody who is a third party vendor who's going to financially benefit from you using their services getting the opportunity to bill for services on your behalf.
And
I'll open it
Sean,
up to the floor. Go ahead.
I have something on this. One of my biggest pet peeves when I'm out, even when I'm speaking at different events, I'll get questions like this. And one of the first things to remember is that company probably needs your physician's order to even be able to make money off of that service. They can't
Such a great
provide
point.
that service without physicians or providers ordering the service. So there's your first problem. That's what happens a ton with devices and everything else. They need your number, they need your order. Second thing, and I think we've talked about this before, but I'm finding so many times in different types of organizations, they are staffing offshore and not being honest with you. So we've talked before about chronic care management. Paul, I know you've had reviews yourself, you've seen this, and they're selling it to you as a product here in the US, but they actually have staff offshore. Now, this depends too. I can't tell in the question if they are selling the actual monitoring services. Because remember, a portion of this could be something like a trained nurse who's looking at the monitoring data and then alerting providers when interventions needed. So my question is, if you don't have staff to bill or whatever that may be, who's actually doing the monitoring? Is it automated? It's supposed to be automated to some extent, but it just scares me when I hear even, billing companies. I'm hearing more and more this year that people hired them, went into contract and had no idea it was offshore. Then you have services you're billing for that didn't even take place in the US.
Yeah,
So I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, and that's a huge problem. Terry and I have addressed this a number of times on our hashtag Terry Tuesdays. If you are a provider, even if you're a US licensed provider and you are outside of the United States, you cannot render services to patients in the United States and be paid for those services by the Centers for Medicare or Medicaid Services and most likely all of the commercial payers. I do want to put up a statement that Ginger Avery made. And this is something that folks, you need to be aware of and you need to heed caution on this. Encoder Pro, this is not the first time I've heard this over the years. They have already changed the descriptors for E&M services, causing even more confusion with 23 codes in the last quarter. If that happens, you need to reach out to your EMR representative and let them know that they need to revert back to the 2023 code descriptions. Because if there was an addition or a revision to a definition that could impact whether or not your provider is still able to bill for that services, because sometimes just changing one word can impact the entire description and definition of a procedure. So, sometimes you go from and to or to and it changes the entire context of that description. I quickly, before we move into, and I'm going to leave exactly 30 minutes for us to talk about our big topic today. But I do want to talk about this one thing called the impossible day. All right. As I said, I just came off of my 7th criminal federal trial in 2023. Each one of these trials brought to light what they considered to be an impossible day. Because what they did was they utilized an individual from a government entity who came in and made these tables. And the tables were all based on typical times. Now, the individual in the case had no coding certifications, no auditing certifications, no experience in statistical sampling, but basically went in and pulled a data file based on typical times, not taking into account that time. And you can go and look at this prior to 2020 in chapter 12 of the Medicare Benefit Policy Manual, section 30.6.1, section B specifically states that time is an ancillary factor in selecting an E&M service and plays no role in the controlling element. of selecting that E&M service. The reason why many prosecutors now and going forward in 2024, not only because there are now 7 cases where they lost, where the defendant was acquitted this year, at least the ones that I was in. There's enough cases now where they're going to abandon it, and here's the reason why. You cannot simply put up a time study based on typical times where it says a 99213 typically takes 15 minutes, because it could take less or it could take more. But my main argument in court was this: if you don't perform a documentation review to confirm or refute your hypothesis, then your time study is fatally flawed, because you have done nothing more than go in to a data bank. You have pulled out a provider's NPI number and you have assumed, and y'all know what happens when you assume things, and you have assumed that the provider took 15 minutes of time for every single patient, which is why they exceeded the number of hours. But think about this. There are many providers who work far beyond 7 hours, 8 hours. We have many providers that work 10 hours, 12 hours, 13 hours in a day, because not only are they doing rounds in the hospital, they're seeing patients in the clinic. But the last thing that I'll say that contributes to it, to why an impossible day is fatally flawed: incident to billing provisions. When a physician is doing everything correctly and they have PAs and NPs working under their NPI number, seeing established patients just as if the physician himself or herself had rendered the services, the argument goes right out the window. And that's why we have successfully defended these physicians this year in these 7 federal criminal trials. So let me stop there. Christine, I think you may have something that you want to say about this.
Well, that's why what I'm seeing right now is a lot of payer audits switching gears from the impossible day or a level of service to attacking medical necessity altogether. Was it medically necessary, or did they meet the medical standards that would support that visit? And that's what I'm seeing right now. So we're kind of heading in a different direction this year. I told Terry the other day, and I told Stephanie at conference, you had mentioned a few months ago that we're entering the era of audit. And since you said it, the phone calls have been coming in droves of the clawbacks that are happening. And a lot of them are attacking medical necessity over the level of service, or just trying to get a reduction in what was billed or what was paid. And really looking at 100% overpayments and extrapolating that out. So just wanted to throw that in there.
I want to say one more thing before you head on to medical necessity on time. I can't be silent on this, because Sean comes from, and everyone knows this, Sean comes from the defensive position, the legal position. He's been in all of these court cases. And Sean, it's expensive to get to the point where you have to defend somebody, correct?
It is not cheap.
Okay. So I come from the offensive position. I don't want anybody to have to hire Sean. Luckily, he's there for you if you need him. But the offensive position on this, and again, our fun football metaphors, sorry, Christine, football's with the pigskin ball, just in case you didn't know. But basically, when we get into the offensive position, that means try to have a clean claim, clean documentation, doing it correctly to start before you have to hire somebody like Sean or doctor's management or a legal team to defend your position, because you just kind of, blew out of the water how it saves you, or it, even if they're going away from that unbelievable day. I'm still auditing for payers that are using that, because nobody's following CPT where it says you have to use what the provider who's billing time, not the staff you hand the chart off to, not the mid-level provider you hand it off. The Medicare payer doesn't let you share a visit in the office. And there's just so many non-face-to-face time or time, for example, and I'll stop from there. If you use your clinical staff, which this is allowed, if you use your clinical staff to help with the history and help with the exam, you cannot use that time as part of your time visit. It's only the billing provider's time. Exactly. And if I see doctors putting in their specific minutes to, it's funny the word they use, to synthesize the record, to order tests and this. I know there's not a doctor sitting there on the phone ordering an echo. They're sending it to their staff to do it. They're not the ones that are ordering it. They're just handing the chart off, and they spend, a couple minutes in their chart documentation to do that. So just be aware that when you're using time, it is scrutinized, it will be questioned. And I just don't want you to go through the expense of having to defend your position. So even though they may be moving away from that, it still exists. And there still are payers that are going to go, really? You really spent an hour and a half with patients?
Well, when I say they're moving away from it, I'm saying prosecutors are moving away from charging people with the impossible day because of the fatal flaws. And stop trying to put me out of business, Terry. God, telling people, oh, Sean's so expensive. Expensive is a relative term, and it's a subjective term. All right, let's go to Stephanie, because you brought this up prior to us going live today. And I think this is really a great way for us to finish out the coding and compliance roundtable for 2023. And it's with a discussion of medical necessity and what is actually going on, and how some providers are trying to circumvent the system by not establishing medical necessity. So let me turn it over to you, and then I want to go around the horn for this one, because this should be an interesting conversation.
Okay, so one thing I want to point out too that's really concerning, not just providers, but the feedback or the rebuttals that I'm seeing and hearing about are even more concerning to me, because it's coming from people in the coding space. So it's coders, it's other auditor reviewers, it's educators. And I'm going to start with an example in the hospital, which I'm sure as we go around the table here, we all have seen it in the office just as much as we've seen it in the hospital. But it was really bothering me a couple weeks ago when I had a conversation, because what was happening is we have one of those scenarios where the patient's admitted to the hospital, and we know that for every organ system involved, there's a specialist for all of those. So we have the hospitalist, and we've got about 3 others or however many others. And what was frustrating is in the documentation, first of all, this year as a whole, we have seen a lot of deficiencies as we're switching into those 2023 revisions in the hospital. So what I mean by that is I don't even recall a specific time right now where the hospital will say subsequent notes showed the names of lab tests being ordered, something other than continue a name of drug to show us what they were thinking through that day to decide to continue the drug. So there's a lot of problems there, but in the comments I was getting back, it was directly related to problems addressed. And the point that they were making in the rebuttal is that, oh no, this definitely supports a level 3 subsequent for high risk, because the patient has all of these comorbidities and they have, whatever organ problem that they had. And when you drill down and look at the documentation, everything for the underlying comorbidities said something along the lines of continue home medication. And then for the actual acute issues going on with that patient, it was saying followed by cardiology, followed by nephrology, or whoever that was. So I understand that this is more of a documentation issue. I'm not saying that we have these physicians and providers in the hospital doing nothing. I don't want to send that message, but we have a long way to go from a documentation perspective. And I understand if we think, about the financials and the fact that we had a huge shift from 3s down to 2s this year under the guidelines. I get it. I know I'm being strict, but for me to have a conversation with a lead of a coding department, and they're saying that because these comorbidities exist, that provider should automatically get credit, is so far off in left field. And, it is leading into other issues in general. When we think about a problem addressed, it's not just what the patient has, it's what that particular practitioner did that day to monitor it, manage it, or it impacted the decisions they were making. And if we don't see it in documentation, we cannot give them the benefit of the doubt. We have to be able to see that in order to count it towards our overall leveling. And last thing I'll say about that, we are completely disconnected now from the thought process that the presenting problem drives your level of service. It's one of our elements. We need a second out of our 3 elements to support what we're billing. So we can have a high risk patient, but if we can't see the rest of the work, we're not going to get to the high level.
Such great points. So Terry, I'm going to go to you next, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, and actually just piggybacking on what Stephanie said there, all you have to do is read the directions in CPT and on page 7 of the professional edition 2023, and it's going to extend into 2024. Just in the first paragraph, it says comorbidities and underlying diseases in and of themselves are not considered in selecting the level of services unless, and that's bolded for emphasis, unless they're addressed and their presence increases the amount of risk and or complexity of data to be reviewed and analyzed, or the risk of complications and or morbidity, mortality, the patient management. And then it goes on to talk about risk versus the problems addressed versus risk from the condition distinct from itself. But the other thing, that there's a perfect example. Before 2021 was changed, if a patient had diabetes, and again, I've got a clinical background, so we I don't want to say we were allowed to make assumptions, but we can make the leap. How about that? Without querying the physician. And patient had diabetes or was a diabetic, and it was very well documented, and they were going to have a hip replacement. And so you could see the risk there in the patient, because patients with diabetes tend to have a lower standard of recovery. Not all of them, but that seems to be a trend. Well, we can't do that after 2021 if you're not addressing it or you don't document that that's your thought process. So if the physician didn't specifically say, patient also is insulin dependent diabetic, and we feel that there's going to be some considerations in long-term recovery, on, then I can make the correlation, but I can't make the assumption anymore. And a lot of doctors are listing these comorbidities, like Stephanie said, and making the assumption. The other thing is on surgery. Oh my gosh. How many people that you're auditing where they're having a major surgery, meaning 90-day global, which shouldn't be a factor, and they're saying because it's a 90-day surgery, automatically that's a level 5. No. You've got a 45-year-old otherwise healthy patient who's got to have major shoulder surgery because they fell on it, but they're healthy. They otherwise, they play tennis. They're on medications. That doesn't make them high risk. It makes them possibly moderate risk if you look at the documentation. But there's so many assumptions made on medical necessity, and people just aren't reading the directions. I mean, read the directions. You have to evaluate or treat the problem, not just list it and say being, followed by, to be able to get credit for that. So.
But Terry, my thought process immediately goes to a lot of the providers have become dependent on the EMR, the EHR, whatever your flavor is. And those EMRs, EHRs didn't automatically update templates to the new 21 guidelines, 23 guidelines. And many of those EMR, EHRs are still providing the 95, 97 templates. And again, if a provider didn't attend some sort of structured education on what the new guidelines are, I'm going to be honest, I've not met one gets their new CPT book in the mail and says, wow, let me read it cover to cover and see what changed. I know there's been a lot of promotion of the new guidelines out there, but not every provider gets the message. So they're really relying on that EMR. This is the EMR that I'm supposed to use in the hospital. This is the EMR that I've purchased in my practice. They may be under a false assumption that any changes would automatically be reflected in that EMR, EHR template, and it's just not happening. So for them, even if they did get the memo, because the template's not updated, it's business as usual, and they're still reporting the excessive history, the excessive review of systems. They're still in that thought process because that's what they see in front of them every day. So I think
Christine, they're also pulling forward a lot of information that they didn't change. I'm seeing review of
Right.
systems that haven't changed or within normal limits or exams within normal limits. And then you go down to the medical decision making where they did get somebody tell them that's changed and it conflicts with the review of systems and the exam. So it's a mess.
Exactly. It
It's a
is. It
mess.
is. And I think that we need to remind everybody on here today, you need to go back and remind your providers, we've got to update our templates. We should never assume that it's automatically being done for us. And maybe that the providers can ask questions if you're struggling how to follow this new guideline.
Absolutely. So, Scott, I want to go to you and Paul because the two of you do, along with Stephanie, as you know, as does Terry and Christine, but the two of you for Doctors Management do a lot of engagement with providers, with their support staff as well. And I could think of a few of the big clients off the top of my head where there's a lot of interaction. Let's talk about some of where Stephanie, Christine, and Terry were going with this and the fact that, you know, not being descriptive, not addressing how you are reviewing different components of a comorbidity, how that doesn't play into the overall risk and the overall medical necessity of that service.
I think there's so much to say about this, and I part of me wants to think about how much trouble I want to get into today or not. But one of the things I talk about with providers and staff a lot with the guidelines is one of the things I liked the most about these guidelines is we curbed a lot of these requirements around extemporaneous documentation. And instead, we created these descriptors that gave the provider a lot of agency to best describe the severity of the patient's condition and best address the risks of the treatments as a result. But I think Christine said this the best. We're so hamstrung by these templates in some ways that that doesn't come through. And when I talked about how much trouble I want to get into or not, I've had a lot of discussions with hospitalists and support staff around medical necessity. And the hospitalist takes a lot of umbrage because they always perceive it as a challenge to their role in the case, their relevance within the case. And I'm not sure if this is a great analogy, but in theory, the hospitalist could function in some respects as like the conductor of the orchestra, right? There's a lot of different potential risks to the patient based on treatment decisions being made by specialists, but often the documentation makes it seem like they're out in the audience with me, right? And they're just saying, well, like per cardiology, this happened, per whomever this happened, and you're not stepping in and making it clear to me like what you're doing. Had an interesting discussion at the conference, and I'll relay it here about a group we worked with on the outside or outpatient, excuse me, where I had an extensive back and forth with a provider about how the guidelines worked. And my expectation was he got off the call understanding the role of medical necessity. And when I did the follow up audit, every patient that had that condition just had 2 more lab tests ordered so that the lab category would go to moderate instead of low. And the last thing I'll say about this for the support staff audience, which is, I think, a lot of our folks today, the guidelines are in some respects a proxy for what we think is good alignment with medical necessity. But as with anything else, it's just an exercise in what you document. And so, we do a little bit of a disservice potentially to the providers when we're not being thoughtful about medical necessity, when we're not being thoughtful about building documentation from the presenting problem and capturing all those severity and history elements and carrying it all the way through so that we on the audit side, we on the support side aren't scratching our heads sometimes and saying, well, why was this lab ordered? The patient's completely negative with respect to the typical risks or the typical things that predicate the ordering of that lab. Like, why is it not clear to me what medication this patient's on and who's responsible for it? Why do I see this condition but I don't see it factored into the treatment plan? Or, sometimes it's the reverse. I audited a note last night where like I didn't hear anything about a heart attack until I got to the assessment and plan. So you think about structure and creation of documentation. Am I crediting a screening lab as part of a diagnostic oriented visit where the provider is basically saying, well, I'm going to get the jump on ordering a bunch of labs for your next physical? Are we leveraging that? And so I realize a bit of a long answer here, but I think medical necessity is critical because it's the foundation upon which the house of the note is built. And if it's deficient, then it's hard to not have these types of conversations where we don't have a great understanding of what exactly is going on.
Such great points. All right, Paul, let me come to you.
So, a lot of great points made about templates, particularly as it applies to acute care in the hospital. I think the most dangerous place where you can bring information forward without change from day to day isn't so much the history elements, and it's not so much the exam elements. I mean, I think about the 1995 guidelines. I'm not sure who I said this to in the last week. It might have been you, Sean, before you went off to your case. But if we think about the formation of the 1995 guidelines, we have to realistically think that the people who drew those up are either retired or dead. And the fact that we're still using templated formats from that, particularly for things like review of systems, which don't even count anymore, we can kind of laugh it off. It's like, oh, rest in peace, whoever brought this forward. But the most important place where you should not be carrying information forward day to day is the assessment and plan. A lot of the acute care notes that I'm looking at, particularly for subsequent hospital visits, just brings forth the original plan from the admission, and then they're updating it when they feel like it. It's like, oh, on such and such a date, I noticed this for this diagnosis. Well, that's really not going to cut it. I mean, I can give you credit for labs if I see that there were labs within the last 24 hours prior to that encounter. But man, you have to start updating the assessment and plan, because that is the guts of your level of service at the end of the day. And, we can bring forward the interval history. We can kind of laugh off all of the PFSH and all of the review of systems that's included there. The examination, I would hope that there are some findings that are at least match the patient's current status as compared to the interval history. But if you're not updating your assessment and plan on a daily basis, and you're just kind of scribbling 2 lines at the bottom of that saying level 3, that's not going to cut it.
Yeah. And so unless somebody else has anything else they want to say
Sean, I have one last thing real quick.
Okay.
On Paul's point.
You got it.
So, Paul, that is an excellent point. And I just want to highlight something that I hear Shannon say often when she's teaching and speaking on this subject. And she's asked us on our team as well. It's not enough to just know what was done. So continue medication. But what did that provider do or what did they analyze to get to the decision that they want to continue that? What did they address? What did they analyze? One other thing I want to point out, Sean put into the chat the definition of problems addressed in the guidelines. For me, when I'm trying to explain this to a provider who is just irritated that we even have to talk about it, I've started to tell them the definition of problems addressed. And I've also started to tell them the definition of analyzed. So if you go into that document, you search for it, there is an AMA definition of analyzing data and using it to make a decision. And that really ties into what Paul was saying there. We've got to see that thought process. I understand that to them, the outcome is the same day to day, so they're trying to save time, but we have to see the thought process behind it.
The last thing I just wanted to add to it, and I know we're short on time, is one of the things I saw the OIG post, and I think it was in the last couple of weeks, and Christine and I are going to be working on a project coming up next year that we were kind of happy to see this very large healthcare entity add this. But when we're auditing, and all of us, whether we're doing it for payers, doing it for providers, and I know a lot of us on this roundtable do it for both, the one thing that people seem to miss is not just the coding piece, the documentation piece, but the medical necessity piece. And OIG posted that an audit without the medical necessity consideration in the actual statistical sample or in the results has no value. It's not, I mean, let's face it, we can make any visit time to what we want it. We can make any visit templated to make it look however we want it. But unless the medical necessity isn't there, and I'm going to shout out my good friend Christine here today. So what did you do today? Then it's really a problem. And the cut and paste, the pull forward, the AI, oh my gosh, how many doctors document like a Harvard professor for a patient today? They don't. So, I mean, I just looked for United Healthcare. I was looking at, I think it was 40 records, and they said, can you look at these? Because we don't understand them. It was all AI generated, and it was just crazy. Sean, you would have loved it. But it was so ridiculous that they would think that this was okay. And the doctor was actually using time. And I said, but you didn't even dictate this. You just put it into AI. He goes, that doesn't matter. I still had the thought. And I was just like, I just was thinking, I wish my roundtable compadres were there. I think especially Paul, because Paul would have been my comic relief going, you've got to be kidding me. But it was just so ridiculous to see that. So just backtracking a little bit, make sure that for those of you that are internal audits, and I'm talking about the listeners, the watchers here, that somebody also is looking at medical necessity for today's encounter, not just the coding, not just the template information, not just as 1 + 1 = level 4. That's not what you're also looking at. You're looking at, does today's visit, as the whole panel has said, does it make sense to get to this level based on the patient's presentation today?
Excellent. All right. So apparently Scott had the quote of the day, which is the foundation of which the house of the note is built. Pretty good there, Scott.
Every now and then.
Every now and then.
It's a bumper sticker. I love it.
An acorn. All right. So the last thing that I was going to say is about cloning, because again, in each of these cases this year, and you hear 7 federal criminal trials, and you may think to yourself, well, that doesn't sound like a lot. Well, 7 trials included 10 defendants. And normally I don't take on more than 3 cases a year. So this was a crazy year. And the amount of preparation, Paul Spencer, Stephanie, Christine, Terry, Scott, they can all tell you what goes into preparing for a federal criminal trial. It is not easy. But the one thing that I will bring up is the fact that in every single one of these cases, cloning was also a big part of their claim for violation of the False Claims Act, or actually in these cases, they were all 18 USC 1347, intent to commit healthcare fraud. Cloning is a problem, but carrying forward a prior past family social history, or carrying forward a prior review of systems on an established patient as a prompt to help a provider know what was transpiring at a prior encounter, that's not cloning. As long as there's enough information that is different in the chief complaint, enough varying information in the history of present illness, enough varying information in the assessment and plan. Remember, cloning is if you were to take a DNA strand, and through that DNA strand, there was absolutely no change whatsoever. And that's how I explained it to the jury this last week. Cloning means exactly that. It is identical from encounter to encounter. Nothing changes. But once you disrupt that DNA strand, it's no longer a cloned note. But one of the things that I've encouraged every provider that I work with to do for the last couple of years, if you are going to carry forward information from a previous note, put a statement in there that says, components of this note do contain cut and paste or carry forward, as it is a way to prompt me to know what transpired during a prior encounter. This information is not necessarily used to select a level of service at today's encounter. And that, as Paul Harvey used to say, is the rest of the story. All right. So I want to say thank you to Paul Spencer, Scott Kraft, Christine Hall, Terry Fletcher, Stephanie Allard, for being such an incredible all-star cast this year. You guys exceeded all expectations. You have been troopers on weeks where we thought we were going to do a segment, and I wound up getting called into a hearing, a trial, or whatever it may have been, and always willing to be available. I know you all had your travel schedules as well, but I would say overall, I would give this show a 9.9 rating for the year, because the amount of preparation that you all have to do to prepare for each week, the knowledge that you bring to the table, and your willingness to share your insights, your knowledge, your experiences with our listeners is what continues to make this program a success. And to each and every single one of you tuning in, logging on, and hanging out with us each and every single Monday, or the Mondays that we are on, thank you so much for doing that. We know sometimes it's not the most exciting stuff that we talk about, but it's critical information to ensure a culture of compliance within your organizations. All right. This is our final episode for 2023. Terry Fletcher and I will have one more segment for 2023, and it will play tomorrow. It will be our final hashtag Terry of 2023, and I know that Terry has something good in store, so I'm looking forward to it. All right, folks, we'll be back in 2024 with an all-new Monday Coding and Compliance Roundtable. So until then, have a happy, healthy, and blessed holiday season, new year. And remember, most importantly, be good to yourselves, but more importantly, be good to each other. Take care.